Rent controls sounds like a great policy, right? You live in a place, you've lived there for years, every year the rent keeps on going up and up and up, and suddenly there's a new policy that says there's a rent freeze. Your rent can no longer go up. But why every city that has ever tried rent controls, the opposite effect happened? Why is it that in every single circumstance, the prices actually go up, rents go up, even though there's a rent freeze? It's counterintuitive. How can freezing rents lead to higher prices, lead to higher rents? Just look at all the cities that have rent controls: New York, California, San Francisco, many other cities around the world, Copenhagen. These coincidentally happen to be the most expensive cities to live in the entire world. The rents in these cities are the highest anywhere else. New York and San Francisco, they have the higher rents in all of the United States, and Copenhagen, one of the highest rents in Europe. And we can see this example throughout history, but also right now. Rent controls right now are less common than they used to be, but we can still see it in many cities. And they are less common now because it's a failed policy. Every time it leads to higher prices. Now, why is that? So usually the rent control is on a specific part of the city. Because why do we have a rent control? The reason for rent control is to help the poor people. So you're not going to have a rent freeze on luxury apartments. You're going to have it in the poorest neighborhoods in the city. It makes sense. But this is a simple supply and demand. If you have a rent freeze in a specific neighborhood in a city, then no builder is going to want to build there because they won't be able to sell the apartments. No one's going to buy it. No one wants to be a landlord in those parts of town. Even no one wants to buy an apartment to live in those parts of town, because what if in the future they want to rent it out? Well, they know they're not. It won't be profitable because once somebody rents it, you can't increase the rent anymore. So nobody wants to buy apartments in rent-controlled areas. Not for investment, meaning they don't want to buy it, so they rent it out, and they don't want to live in just in case in the future they want to rent it out. So no one's going to build in those rent-controlled areas. So of course, supply in those areas go down. But why does it lead to higher prices in other parts of the city? Obviously, when we say rent controls lead to higher prices, we don't mean in the rent-controlled areas. We mean in the entire city outside of those rent-controlled areas. Well, it's simple because, first of all, the supply of housing will go down in the rent-controlled area, but also outside of rent-controlled area, because once a city set the precedent of having rent control in one part of the city, well, what stops them from expanding it to other parts of the city? Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but you'll never know that. So you'll be afraid. You'll say, okay, of course I'm not going to buy an apartment in the rent-controlled area, but what if I buy an apartment in another neighborhood and there's a rent control there? And what if I decide to move out of that apartment and rent it out? Well, that wouldn't be a good idea, because once the rent control is in place, if you rent it to someone, that's it, you can't increase their rent. So no matter how much inflation there is, you just can't increase their rent. So it doesn't make much of a business sense to buy, even outside of the rent area, because who knows, maybe tomorrow the policy will expand. So that's the first reason. But of course, the second reason is for builders, they would rather build luxury homes, because usually the rent controls, the rent freeze applies to, as we said earlier, applies to certain low income housing. So usually doesn't apply to luxury homes, because what's the point, right? The entire purpose of this policy is to help the poor, but luxury housing is not really for the poor. So there wouldn't be any rent freezes on, let's say, upscale areas of the town. So now all builders, all developers are just going to build luxury homes. And luxury homes, they're just more expensive. So the average rents, the average housing cost in the city will go up, because there will be less building of ordinary housing and there will be more building of luxury housing. Now, of course, if you're lucky enough to be living in an area and suddenly you find out that there is a rent freeze, yeah, that's good for you. You're gonna benefit. Congratulations, you're one of the winners. And of course, you're not gonna move out. You're gonna stay there for as long as you can, because you know your rent is not gonna go up. Why would you move to another part of the city, especially because other parts of the city, the prices now just soar because of the rent control. So you're not going to move out. You're going to stay there for a very, very long time. And of course, everyone else's rent is going to go up. So every other renter are the loser in this transaction, and landlords are losers in this transaction, and anyone who owns a home are losers in this transaction. But yeah, the few people who live in those rent controlled areas, they benefit. Now, and they're going to stay there for a long time. Now, at some point, that person may move, right? There's an In the unlikely event, maybe they're going to have to move to a different country or a different city for work or something. So they vacate, and now the landlord can increase the price, because the rent freeze is the freeze on your rent on your contract that you already have, right? So if you're paying $2,000 in rent, then there's a rent freeze on that until you move out. And once you move out, the landlord can change their strategy. They can either turn your apartment to a luxury apartment and jack up the price, and now it's not going to be considered a rent controlled unit. Or if they rent it out to someone else, and they can set any rent they want. And let's say by that point, few years down the line, the rent in that apartment that you used to stay in and you pay $2,000 for them, let's say the market rate for that unit is now $5,000. Well, the landlord is not going to rent it out for $5,000. They're going to rent it out for $10,000, $12,000. Why? Because they know that once the new tenant moves in, they can't increase their rent anymore. So why would they give them the market price? So they're going to give them a much higher rate, because they know that this person is not going to move out. And in the meantime, they can't raise their rents on them. So they're going to do whatever they can now. $10,000, $15,000. That's what they're going to ask for. And if you don't want to accept, fine. They're not going to rent it out at the market price under any circumstances, because they're going to be losing money. So they're either going to charge higher rent for the available for the unit that they have, or they're just going to change it to a luxury apartment, and most likely they're going to do that. And now it's not going to be a rent controlled unit anymore. So now they can also jack up the price. So anyways, once you move out of a rent controlled unit, the rent for those units are going to go up, even in the rent controlled areas. So all of this is going to push up the rents across the city, and most importantly, it's going to be the supply, is that the developers will develop less, because buying a home is going to be less profitable. Building homes is going to be less profitable. So supply will go down, and that will push up prices. That will push up prices of new homes, of old homes, of rents, of buying an apartment. So that's why we see that in any city that has any even small area, rent controlled area, the median rents in the entire city goes up. Now you could say, well, the solution to that problem is just make the whole city a rent freeze zone, right? Well, then builders are just not going to build in that city. They're just going to go to another city. They're going to go to another state. They're going to go to another country. I mean, it's not a big deal. Uh, it might be a big deal, but it's a bigger deal if you just build in the same city and not make any money and go bankrupt. I mean, why would you do that? It's gonna be less risky to just pack up and move to a different city. Take your workers or fire your workers and hire new people in another city. Just take your capital, take all the money that you've made in the past few years, and then just move on to another city or another state or another country. So so at the end of the day, and we hear today a lot from many cities around the world, many policymakers, and even many residents of cities, they ask for rent controls, they ask for freezes. Most notably, just recently, the newly elected mayor of New York has proposed rent freezes. Even though New York already has rent freezes, but I guess it's better to double down on the policy, right? Hoping that this time there will be a different consequence.